In a world where the dead no longer rested but roamed the earth, hunger and despair were as constant as the ever-looming presence of walkers. Survivors carved out fragile lives amidst the decay, constantly looking over their shoulders as death lingered both in front and behind. The prison had become home for Rick Grimes and his group, a cold, concrete fortress promising safety, if not comfort, in a reality stripped of both. Its sturdy walls stood as a bastion against both the undead and the living who had become just as dangerous. But what if the darkest of those living forces, the governor, had chosen a path other than war? The last time Rick had seen the governor, it was through the sights of his rifle. Their two groups had eyed one another with gnashing teeth in the neutral space between Woodbury and the prison, the battlefield of distrust. The man with the eye patch had worn a mocking smile, his twisted aura palpable even from a distance, hatred hidden beneath an unassuming calm. Yet, despite the tension, blood had not been spilled that day. They'd retreated, but Rick had known this wasn't the end. He'd prepared his people for the inevitable fight, stockpiling weapons and rehearsing drills for weeks. But the assault never came. It had been 2 months since they'd last heard from Woodbury, and in that time, the prison had grown quieter. The walkers still pressed against the outer fences each day, their claws scraping against metal like nails on a chalkboard, their guttural groans a haunting ambient chorus. But the living, silence, save for the occasional scout call signaling a lone survivor or a threat on the horizon. The wardens of their stronghold watched from the towers, always vigilant, always ready. And yet, all the while, Rick couldn't shake the feeling of unease stewing inside him. Daryl Dixon sat next to Rick late one night at the inner fence, sharpening the blade of his knife. The fire burning in the barrel beside them cast long, flickering shadows across his face. "So what? The bastard just decided to let it go," Daryl muttered, dragging the blade across the whetstone with deliberate skepticism. "Guy loses an eye, loses his people, and what? He just up and forgives that?" Rick chewed the inside of his cheek, his hands resting on the cold steel of the fence. It had been gnawing at him for weeks now, the quiet. The governor didn't seem like the kind of man who knew what it meant to let things lie. "I don't buy it either," he finally said, his voice low. "Men like him, they don't just stop, they wait." "And while he's waitin'," Daryl said, slipping his knife back into its sheath, "we're sitting right here like ducks, hoping those damn fences don't fall down again." The truth stung, mainly because Rick knew Daryl was right. The repairs to the fences were ongoing. Wooden braces patching places where walkers had pushed too hard, brittle enough that the group took turns reinforcing weak spots every few days. They didn't have the manpower or the resources to fix things the way they needed. Not after the sickness that had swept through the cell block weeks earlier. They were recovering, but not fast enough. They weren't ready for another attack. Not yet. But the attack never came, not in the way they'd imagined. Winter edged closer, and one morning, Michonne spotted something strange on the horizon. A lone figure emerging from the mist, holding up empty hands as if to signal peace. Rick and the others assembled at the front gate, weapons raised, their expressions hard. The figure was a woman, one of the governor's people, they would later learn, and her name was Karen. She was thin, weary-looking, with fear etched deep into the lines of her face. "I've come to talk on behalf of Woodbury," she said nervously, her fingers trembling as she clutched the strap of the bag slung across her shoulder. "Philip, She faltered, as if unable to find the right words. "The governor wants to meet, not for a fight, for a truce." Rick's first instinct was suspicion. None of them trusted this. They didn't trust her. Tyrese, who stood by Karen's side and recognized her from his time in Woodbury, said, "She's tellin' the truth, at least about who she is." But even his tone remained guarded. The words truce and governor didn't belong in the same sentence. It sounded absurd, like a trap waiting to spring. Maggie whispered her fears to Glenn later that night. "What if he just wants to get us all in one place so he can kill us faster?" It was the same thought running through everyone's mind. But Karen hadn't come empty-handed. As though to back up her story, she'd brought medicine. trucks of antibiotics, painkillers, and bandages. She claimed they were leftovers from the raids Woodbury conducted before the prison group had even found each other. They had extras they couldn't use, she told them, and they didn't want it to go to waste. Whether out of desperation or curiosity, Rick agreed to the meeting. The governor arrived at the neutral ground alone, without his usual entourage of armed muscle. The sight of him without a gun in hand, and no hatred in his eye, put Rick on edge more than anything else. Yet his tone was calm when he spoke. Deliberate. "I was wrong," the governor said simply. "About attacking you. About everything." Rick wasn't sure what game this was, but the words caught him off guard. They were hollow, falling from the lips of a man who had destroyed too many lives. They couldn't mean what they seemed to, could they? "What do you want, then?" Rick asked, his voice low but firm. His hand lingered near the gun holstered at his side. The governor exhaled deeply, his gaze shifting toward the woods. For a moment, his mask slipped, revealing something that almost looked like sorrow. "I thought I was a leader," he said. "Thought I was keeping people safe. But in the end, I only brought death to the people who trusted me. To my own daughter." Rick's expression darkened at the mention of Penny, the governor's Walker-turned child locked away in Woodbury. His heart ached for Judith in that same moment, the fragile baby girl who cooed innocently within the prison walls. "That wasn't your decision to make," Rick shot back. "Keeping her like that, it wasn't right." "I know," the governor admitted. His once hard, venomous voice was eerily soft now. "But what I'm trying to do now, this truce, it's not about me. It's about the people still alive in Woodbury, the people I didn't get killed. Half of them are sick, Rick. Their rooftops can only keep out so much rain. And food? We've got days left. Maybe weeks." He raised his hands in surrender. "I don't want your prison. I don't want it anymore. I just want us to survive. Together." Lines had formed across Rick's forehead as he listened. His gut was twisted tight with distrust, but behind that doubt, he sensed, against all instinct, a sincerity that could almost be genuine. What if this was real? What if, against every warning bell blaring in his head, the governor really had come to lay down arms? The thought gnawed at him long after the meeting ended. The group debated far into the night, voices clashing like swords as everyone gave their opinion. Some were adamant that working with the man who'd killed so many of their own, who'd slaughtered Axel, captured Maggie and Glenn, and pitted survivors against each other for sport, shouldn't even be an option. Others, though wary, saw Karen's desperation as proof that this alliance could mean survival. Not just for them, but for everyone. The vote came down to one deciding choice, the burden as always falling on Rick. In the end, he made the hardest decision of all. A week later, the governor walked through the gates of the prison alongside a dozen of his people. Time didn't heal old wounds, but the living found ways to coexist. To some, it felt like adding gasoline to a campfire, waiting for the inevitable moment it all exploded. Michonne especially kept close watch, always a step behind the governor, gripping her katana like a silent shadow promising judgment. But weeks turned into months, and what should have ended in chaos became something unexpected. Together, the two groups worked to patch the fences, to clear debris, to hunt, and to grow food in the overgrown yards of the prison. The governor, now Philip, as he insisted people call him, kept to his part of the bargain, often spending time away from the central prison block, where less than half of the group ever learned to fully trust him. Though every glance he exchanged with Rick carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken threats, their truce, fragile though it remained, held. And when the herd came months later, numbering in the hundreds, it wasn't Rick's group or the governor's people alone who fought to hold the gates. It was both of them, standing shoulder to shoulder, hacking through walkers with desperate, bloody precision. For the first time since the outbreak, survival had emerged from something more than fear and violence. It had come from a single choice, not to war, but to try. The alliance between the prison group and Woodbury remained a precarious balancing act, every uneasy glance or clipped word an ever-present reminder of the bloodshed that still lingered in their memories. Time and necessity had forced them to coexist, But trust was slow to come, if it ever would. Rick spent his days walking the prison grounds, inspecting the fences, observing the makeshift farms, and watching the two groups intermingle like oil on water, never quite mixing, but swirling too closely to ignore each other. From afar, he saw Herschel comforting Maggie after one of her night terrors, Glenn by her side with a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. Investigating the roots of that pain wouldn't take much effort. Everyone understood the scars left by the governor's actions. Rick's own temper flared just thinking about how these people, the same ones who had brutalized, tortured, and hunted them, were now sleeping in cells just a block away, eating the same food they fought tooth and nail to gather. But then, there were moments like the one unfolding now. Tyrese and Sasha showing Karen how to reinforce a crossbeam, her laughter thin and uncertain but real. Rick caught Carl in the corner of his vision, watching the exchange with narrowed eyes as he unholstered his pistol to clean it, the boy's fingers steady and mechanical. If anything went wrong, Rick knew Carl wouldn't hesitate. That thought chilled him more than it should, though he understood how the boy had grown into what the world demanded of him. Michonne leaned against a concrete wall nearby, her katana sheathed but her presence a constant warning. She rarely left Rick's side for long, her searing eyes always clocked on the man she had sworn to kill. And though Philip, the governor, kept to himself more often than not, Rick could feel her tension rise whenever he walked within 30 feet of them. She never said anything, but her silence spoke for her. If he even twitched in the wrong direction, she'd finish what Rick, in her mind, should have done months ago. For now, Philip was seated by the inner fence, peeling potatoes alongside Beth and a couple of woodberry transplants. The act was so domestic it felt alien. A man like him reduced to something mundane, his old airs of dominance distant if not gone. Daryl, walking past Rick with a freshly caught squirrel slung over his shoulder, spat into the dirt and muttered, "Ain't trustin' that snake no matter how many damn potatoes he peels." Rick nodded in agreement, his jaw tightening. "I don't trust him either." "You shouldn't," came Michonne's voice from the wall without a trace of hesitation. Her words carried the weight of finality, like gravity. There was no rebuttal Rick could offer. He didn't wholly disagree. He was walking a knife's edge with all of this, and everyone knew it. But the choices they'd made so far had kept them alive. Longer than expected. That had to count for something, right? The days pressed on, life at the prison becoming a careful rhythm of reinforced necessity. And for all his mistrust, Rick couldn't ignore that Philip's people brought something the prison had needed desperately. Numbers. The sick were no longer confined to half-functioning beds in the cell block thanks to the medicines Karen delivered. Repairs were speeding up, hunting parties grew more effective, and more than once Rick had seen Sasha lead a Woodbury patrol on a run that returned with food even Daryl hadn't been able to find before. Still, the shadows of the past loomed, and there were whispers, dark murmurs that swirled between both factions, layered with doubt, anger, maybe even vengeance. Small fights broke out, Glenn shoving one of Philip's bruisers after an offhand remark, Lily from Woodbury slapping Carol after an argument about rationing. Tempers always cooled before real damage was done, but no mediation could overwrite the war of histories locked in their glares. Rick saw it in his own home, too. Carl had never outright defied him about the alliance, but his silence bristled like a storm on the edge of the horizon. He had yet to speak a word to anyone from Woodbury, moving past them like shadows, or like they didn't exist at all. Once, when Philip walked too close to Judith's playpen, Rick caught Carl's hand twitch toward his gun out of sheer instinct. Carl's voice reached him later in private, shaking but somehow cold. "Why didn't you just kill him?" The question lingered worse than any accusation. Carl didn't ask for an answer. He didn't have to. And still, after everything, Rick couldn't shake the gnawing sense that whatever was happening, whatever fragile reprieve they had carved out, it was temporary. The governor may have traded his weapons for a plow, but men like him didn't forget the taste of power. Rick knew because he'd worn it himself. And what happens to a man like that when all he has to fall back on is his shame? Rick didn't dare ask. The answer came in the dead of night. It started with a piercing scream that shattered the silence of the prison's courtyard. loud enough to wake everyone. Rick leapt from his bed, snatching his revolver from where it rested under his pillow. For half a second, his mind flashed to memories of the herd, but this was no walker's groan. This was human. Chaos erupted in the cell block as people poured into the halls, fear and confusion written across every face. Daryl was already up, crossbow in hand, as he barked an order for Maggie to check on Judith. The scene by the south fence was chaos. Two of Woodbury's people were crouched over Karen, who was clutching her arm while blood seeped through her fingers. She was sobbing, her eyes wide with terror as she looked up at Rick and then past him, toward the man standing a few yards away. Philip. The governor's knife was in his hand. Blood-streaked. Walker pieces, Rick thought. He nearly said it out loud. Everyone knew to check bodies by the fence after culling walkers for any scrapes or splinters leading to infection. But the scene didn't add up. Karen wasn't yelling about walkers. She was begging, pleading. He attacked me, she choked out, gasping through her tears. Rick froze, his mind reeling. Daryl stepped forward with a snarl, his crossbow already raised. What the hell's this about, you son of a... Philip raised his hand, palm open. His face, bathed in the dim glow of the floodlight overhead, was eerily calm. I didn't attack her, Rick, he said evenly, rationally. I stopped her. Rick's knuckles went white around the grip of his revolver. Even without looking, he felt Michonne's presence now, frozen somewhere behind him like a coiled spring, waiting, always waiting, for her moment. Philip gestured toward the fence. She was opening it, he continued. She had the keys. I stopped her before more walkers could get in. Check her pockets if you don't believe me. The yard felt colder than it had any right to be. For a moment, no one moved. Then one of the Woodbury men reached into Karen's jacket, hesitating only briefly before pulling out a ring of keys. The jangle made Rick's stomach drop. Karen shook her head wildly, sobbing harder now. No, it's not. He's lying. That bastard's lying. You're not helping your case, Philip said quietly. Rick stared at the governor, then at Karen. She shrank backward under his gaze, stammering, trying to explain, trying to say anything, but nothing she said swayed the ice settling over Rick's thoughts. Rick? Michonne growled behind him, her voice low and dangerous. Do not let him twist this. Rick couldn't think, couldn't breathe as the weight of the night pressed down on him. Dark thoughts dredged themselves up, clawing through his reason. Was the governor right? Had Karen, a woman Tyrese vouched for, a supposed fighter, a survivor, been plotting behind everyone's backs? Or was this his play all along? A power move, wrapped in blood and silver lies? The governor stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough for only Rick to hear. You're a leader, he said in a tone that almost sounded like respect. You know what has to be done. Rick's stomach churned. It was happening again. The moral weight of survival. The choice. Always the damn choice, to trust, to believe, to kill, to hold on to whatever shreds of humanity might remain. And every time, the ground underneath him grew shakier, like one day the earth itself would finally swallow him whole. Somewhere near the gate, Carl's voice cut through the dark. Dad? Rick glanced over his shoulder, catching his son's wide eyes, watching and waiting, desperate, silent. For once, the boy wanted to see Rick as more than a leader, a father, a man who knew the right call. But there was no right call. Not in this world. Nowhere. Not anymore. Rick looked at the governor again, then at Karen, the sounds of the prison humming in the background. The lingering sobs, the scrape of knives being unsheathed, the wind carrying the distant groans of walkers beyond the fence. The governor's voice echoed in his ear. You know what has to be done. Rick didn't answer. His revolver stayed in his grasp, as steady and silent as the breath he wished he believed could bring him peace. It wasn't peace he felt. It was dread. Rick's eyes darted between Karen and the governor, his fingers twitching on the grip of his revolver. Time felt stretched, like the weight of every ripple his next decision might make was bearing down on him all at once. When he spoke, it was cold but measured, as though someone else entirely had taken hold of his voice. "Tyrese," Rick said, his gaze never leaving the governor. "Take Karen back to the infirmary. Make sure she's looked after." Karen's sobs broke into a guttural crawl of relief, though her words remained incoherent. Tyrese hesitated, glancing first at Rick and then at Philip, as though gauging the invisible perimeter of danger between the two men. Finally, he wrapped a cautious arm around Karen's shoulders and began leading her away, her feet dragging through the dirt. Philip didn't move. Neither did Rick. "You believe her?" the governor asked, his voice low but strangely devoid of venom. "I don't trust you," Rick answered. The words hit the air like the long, slow snap of something breaking. Philip tilted his head slightly, as though studying him, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to, but if you don't trust me, then you better start trusting someone." "That fence?" he said, gesturing toward the south gate with the blood-stained knife still in his hand. "Is all that stands between us and the kind of dead that doesn't have two sides to argue." Rick wanted to shoot him, wanted to pull the trigger and let the single booming crack sever this delicate alliance once and for all. He could almost feel the air thicken around him, like Michonne's stance behind his shoulder radiated permission. She would never say the words, but they were there. "Do it," her silence urged. "End this." And God help him, Rick wanted to. But the weight of the group pressed on him. The faces in the courtyard, the wary, tired faces of people who had spilled their own blood, endured agony, and buried their loved ones. All those eyes rested on Rick now. It wasn't just about him or Michonne or even Karen. It was about all of them. Rick holstered his revolver. "Watch the fence," he said simply, his voice betraying no emotion, before turning away. The tension still clung to the air long after Rick had walked off, his half-full shadow swallowed by the dim light of the prison yard. Daryl stayed rooted in place, his eyes flashing fire toward the governor. "Fenced hold fine if it wasn't you standin' near it," he muttered darkly, his crossbow lowering slightly but his presence no less dangerous. "If I wanted any of you dead," Philip said, meeting Daryl's glare with unnerving patience, "I'd have done it long before now." He wiped the blood from his blade, tucking it back into its sheath. There was nothing more anyone could say to that, not out here in the yard under the weight of so many watchful faces. Philip turned and sauntered off to his cell block, leaving the lingering question of what or who might really kill them first, the walkers outside or the fractures inside. The night never fully calmed after that. In the days that followed, the camp's uneasy balance continued to fray. Karen recovered in the infirmary, but her presence was a flashpoint. She was either the brave survivor of a leader's tyranny or the reckless instigator of chaos, depending on who you asked. Conversations grew cautious, guarded, ricocheting among the factions like whispers in a crowded room, everyone wondering what the next spark might ignite. Rick tried to push forward. That's what he always did, push forward. But he couldn't escape the choking sense that he was sprinting blind into fog, with the edges of a cliff somewhere ahead. His interactions with the governor were kept functional, clipped, and always in full view of others. It wasn't until one morning, while inspecting the fences with a sleep-deprived Michonne, that Rick noticed something that froze him in place. A single, thin streak of blood running down the outer side of the south gate. Fresh. "What the hell is that?" Michonne asked, stepping closer to inspect the metal. Behind the gate, in the overgrown woods, at least a dozen walkers thrashed against the barrier. Their groans were louder than normal, their clawing more violent, though the fence still held, for now. Rick prodded one of the streaks with the tip of his machete, squinting. "Not theirs," he muttered, more to himself than to Michonne. The blood was deliberate, like someone had applied it to the bars of the gate. Her fingers flexed near the hilt of her katana. "Looks like bait," she said warily. Rick's jaw clenched, and his mind raced. Bait for walkers. It wouldn't take much. A thin coating and a breeze carrying the scent could attract a small group, enough to stress the fence. Maybe even enough to breach it in weak spots. Whoever had done this knew exactly what they were doing. "Karen?" Michonne asked, though even she didn't sound convinced. Rick's stomach sank. This was deeper than Karen. He could feel it, like an infection festering unseen beneath the surface, poisoning everything. That night, Rick called an impromptu meeting in the prison yard. They gathered in a loose circle, Woodbury and the original prison group standing on opposite ends like two magnetic poles too opposed to connect. A cold wind stirred the eerie stillness of the courtyard, carrying the quiet groans of the circled perimeter of walkers beyond the fences. Carl leaned against a concrete wall near Judith, his eyes guarded and distrustful. Rick scanned the faces before him, the familiar ones etched into his heart like scars, and the newer ones he still couldn't quite root his trust in. His own voice sounded distant when he finally spoke, forcing down the knot in his chest. "This group survives together," Rick began. "We fight the dead. We don't fight each other. And right now, what we're doing, it's tearing us apart." His eyes settled briefly on Philip, who stood near the back with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Rick took a long breath. 2 days ago, the south fence was tampered with. Someone, not something. I found blood coated on it. Pulling walkers toward a gate we're barely keeping standing as it is. The revelation landed like a physical blow. Nervous murmurs rippled through the crowd. Sasha stiffened near Tyrese, and Karen, still pale and bandaged, looked briefly stunned, then furious. "I know what you're all thinking," Daryl interrupted, his voice cutting through the stirrings of the crowd. "And I'd bet everything I've got you're right, too." His glare locked onto the governor with the force of a sword being drawn. "I didn't touch the fence," Philip said calmly, his one good eye settling on Rick as if daring him to challenge the claim. Glenn stepped forward, his fists clenched tightly. "Why should any of us believe you haven't? You've done worse before." The tension tripled in the space of seconds. Philip remained steadfast, his expression impossibly composed. Rick closed his eyes briefly. He didn't have time for this. Another fracture in the group now, and they wouldn't just break apart, they'd die for it. He needed to get ahead of this, to restore some sense of control before the whole thing spiraled beyond fixing. "Enough!" Rick's shout silenced the yard. His voice was steel now, tempered in the constant fire of the decisions he could never truly escape. "We don't play the blame game," he continued, his words raw with conviction. His eyes swept the crowd, old faces and new. "We deal in survival. That's it. If someone's working against that, we're gonna root him out. But until we know for sure, everyone keeps their head down and stays focused. We've got fences to mend, water to pump, food to scavenge. We don't waste energy on something we don't know." He let his words hang, watching their impact ripple through stone-stiff expressions. Some resigned, some angry. The governor's face betrayed nothing, though his presence alone felt like a clenched fist against Rick's spine. "For now," Rick finished, his voice quieter but still firm, "we tighten the shifts. Everyone stays in pairs. No one works alone." His gaze lingered on Michonne. "We watch each other. That's how we get through this." The gathering eventually dispersed, the factions retreating to uneasy corners of the prison like fractured puzzle pieces that refused to align. Rick remained rooted in the yard long after it emptied, pacing beneath the faint glow of the tower lights as his thoughts tore at him from the inside. "Pairs, huh?" Michonne emerged from the shadows behind him, leaning casually against a concrete column. "Gonna assign me to babysit him?" She didn't need to say the governor's name. "Would you do it?" Rick asked, not as a challenge but a genuine question. Michonne exhaled slowly, the motion carrying the weight of unsaid things. "For you? Maybe." Her tone was sharper now. "But you're chasing your tail, Rick. That man, he's waiting. Waiting for the moment you slip, or the moment we turn on ourselves. Either way, he wins and we lose." Rick didn't answer right away. Instead, his gaze wandered past the fences, out into the blackness of the world beyond. For the first time tonight, he could swear the darkness was moving, flickering. Not walkers, but something alive. Something watching. Something waiting. Or maybe that was just how it always felt now.